Check the description for the following discount codes. Another request from everyone out there with the CSL DDs is what force feedback settings I use for dirt rally. Obviously I have this huge rally Sparco wheel on here, and what that does mean is whilst these settings are the best settings for me, they may not be the best settings for you. If you're not using this enormous wheel with this deep dish and with its huge diameter, my settings are going to feel very different for you to what they do for me. And also, as always, with these settings videos, I won't just be going, here's a screenshot of my settings, copy them. I will explain what each setting does so that should you not like the settings I show you, you now have the knowledge to adjust each one confidently to get it how you do want it to feel. Because in Dirt Rally, they don't tell you what each setting does. There's no like help bubble that appears. You're just supposed to know, which is ridiculous. Now in the Fanatec control panel, there are help bubbles that pop up with really good detailed descriptions of what each setting does. So I won't be reading those out. You've all got the ability to read them for yourselves, I'm sure. But in Dirt Rally, I'll explain what everything does that way. If you don't like my settings, you'll know what to change. You know, maybe it's too heavy for you overall. Maybe it's not heavy enough in the corners. Maybe you're not getting enough feedback from the suspension. I'll explain what everything does. Setting by setting. So we'll start off in the Fanatec control panel. So Fanatec control panel, let's get that loaded up. Just follow your shortcut wherever it may be. There you'll see your Fanatec CSL DD. Now you can go to the tuning menu here and you can click between advanced or standard. To be honest, I don't know if you can hear my cat plucking in the background, probably. Ori, stop plucking. To be honest, there's not that much I've actually adjusted from default. Auto mode here actually prevents you from adjusting things, and if the sim or game you're playing supports it, will set the sort of manufacturer's or game developers settings for you. Obviously, if you want to do it yourself, you need to come to at least set up one here where you can go down through all the options. Now, as I said in the intro, if you hover over these, they tell you exactly what they do really clearly and really easy to understand. So I won't read them out, but I will read what my settings are. So maximum steering angle is on auto because I want my degrees of rotation to be set by the sim I'm in and not overridden by what I sit here, but what I set here. Excuse me. Overall force feedback strength, obviously, we want this at 100%, and I would do this for any wheelbase because this is like an overall limiter. So if you've bought a 20 Newton meter wheelbase and you set that to 75 or 50 or whatever, you might as well have bought a weaker wheelbase because you're literally turning off some of its power straight away. So that's obviously at 100. This is an interesting one. Force feedback scaling for the CSL DD. Default is to have that on peak. For my DD1, default was linear, and I'm guessing this is because of the different strengths of the motors. The DD1 being a lot more powerful versus this little 5 or 8 Newton meter setup, depending what power supply you have. So I left it on peak because there isn't that much power there, so you're not going to get nasty spikes like you might do from the more powerful wheels. Natural dampers on 50, natural friction and inertia are both off. You'll get that sort of friction and inertia from the force feedback coming from the telemetry from whatever sim you're in anyway. So that's neither here nor there. Force feedback interpolation filter is on 11. Again, I think this is default. And then the effects, all 4 effects intensities are at 100% because I don't feel like I need to turn them down for anything. Other things you'll see here in this, and you can do a lot of this from this main screen here. Wheel center calibration. It's worth calibrating your wheel if you haven't already done so, but if you've updated to the latest firmware, which you probably should do, it forces you to calibrate anyway. So that is all there really is in here. Make sure you're not on auto if you want to adjust things yourself. Go to advanced if you want to just have a look through there. But as I say, I haven't really changed much, to be honest. And the ones that, if in the simple mode, standard mode here, the ones that you would want to change, your natural damper the overall strength and steering angle, I've left all at default anyway. But that's what I'm running, and I can get the wheel to feel how I want it to feel in Dirt Rally like this. So there's no reason to play around with it, as far as I'm concerned. It works with these settings, and of course, I don't also want to have, you've got 5 different setups you can store here. I don't want to have different setups here for different sims. If I can help it, I'd rather find a good sort of base settings here and then tweak each sim individually, because every sim we use has its own sort of fine-tuning controls and a whole plethora of options anyway. So yeah, let's get into those now then. So let's get Dirt Rally up here. Obviously you want to go to your options and input, and make sure it shows up as Fanatec Club Sport for me. I'm sure it will for you as well. Make sure that is highlighted and set as your primary device. You want to come down to device options and you want to calibrate the steering wheel. This is really, really important, otherwise the soft lock feature that I'll explain later won't work. So just follow the instructions there to calibrate the wheel. It's your basic turn it left, turn it right jobby. Once that's done, we can then go to edit device. First tab is input bindings. For me, I've only got left and right because my steering wheel doesn't have any buttons on it. If you've got steering wheel buttons on, obviously you can map these to be, headlights, recover vehicle, whatever you choose. For me, it's just left and right because that's all I have. Also though, if you've got your H-pattern shifter plugged into the wheelbase, you would map that here as well because it's all coming through the wheelbase. And presumably the pedals as well. I have my pedals plugged in via USB for complicated reasons. But if you've got them plugged in through the wheelbase, that you may well do your accelerator, brake and clutch here as well. I don't know because I don't run it like that. Click over to advanced settings. Steering linearity. This is where if you have a non-linear curve on your steering, the more you turn the steering wheel, the more the wheels will turn at a multiplied rate. So that means it would be not very sensitive around the center area, and then by the time you're getting near full lock, it would be super sensitive. For me, I don't like that. I like a linear input. The dead zones throughout these options here for the steering, the throttle, the brake, the clutch, they're all exactly the same type of thing. You don't need to set a dead zone for any of your inputs, especially the steering, unless you have old noisy equipment, which the CSL DD shouldn't be. And what I mean by noisy is it's registering left and right steering inputs when you're not actually moving the wheel. If that was the case, you would set a dead zone to map out that noisy center position. But that also means you'd then have a delay between when you turn your steering wheel and when it actually starts to turn, because you'd have to move it beyond the dead zone. So you don't really want a dead zone. If you've got random steering inputs when you're not actually moving the wheel, you've got a problem with your wheelbase or some electrical noise somewhere. Same for the throttle, same for the brake. Clutch, I run a small dead zone because I rest my foot on the clutch, which means it will register a small input. And obviously I don't want to be riding the clutch, so to speak. Steering saturation, throttle saturation, brake saturation, this all means the same thing, which is at 100%, you'll need to turn your steering wheel, press your accelerator, press your brake or press your clutch all the way down or all the way through its rotation, I'm talking about the steering wheel, to reach 100% steering, whatever your degrees of rotation might be, 280, 420, 900, depending on the car you're in. Throttle pedal all the way down to the floor. If for example, you didn't want to press the throttle all the way down to the floor to get 100% steering input, you could turn the throttle saturation down to say 50%, in which case 50% pedal travel would be 100% throttle input in the game. And the same would apply to the steering. But why you'd want to turn your steering like only half of its rotation to register 100% rotation in the game, I do not know. That would make no sense. Especially as Dirt Rally has this really good soft lock feature that I'll talk about in a minute. So that's what the saturations do. If you want to, again with the brake pedal, if you don't want to have to apply maximum pressure if you're a load cell, or maximum travel if you're potentiometer or Hall effect sensor, you could reduce it here, but I like everything at 100%. As I say, clutch dead zone because I rest my foot on it. My saturation is at 60 because for me, with these V3 pedals, they have a simulated biting point or simulated clutch springs. And by clutch springs, I mean the springs within the pressure plate of a real life clutch. So you can feel as you bring the pedal up where you just overcome those springs, or where those springs apply more pressure than before. That is roughly where your biting point would be. I set my saturation to match that, so that when I'm sat at the line about to launch, I can bring the clutch up to where I feel the biting point on under my foot, and in the game the car is just starting to edge itself forward, it's just starting to bite. That way, when the lights go green, I can just dump the clutch the rest of the way and we pull off straight away, saving a couple of milliseconds. Whereas if I had it all the way down to the floor, there'd be a few fractions of a second where I lift my foot up until it gets to that biting point and then engages. So that's why my clutch saturation is at 60. Soft lock on. Soft lock is a brilliant feature in Dirt Rally that will adjust the degrees of rotation of your steering wheel or your lock based on the car you are in. So modern rally cars will have a much more responsive, faster and shorter rack, maybe 280 degrees lock to lock, whereas an old 60s, 70s rally car might be 900 degrees, might be over 1,000 degrees, 1020, 1040, and so you'll need to turn the wheel much further to get the same steering input as you would on a modern rally car. For me, this is super important, because if you turn this off and just fix your steering lock at, say, I don't know, 450 degrees, somewhere in the middle, every single car in Dirt Rally will feel exactly the same to drive from a steering input point of view. And that really takes away from the simulation side of this experience, where you're driving different cars and they feel very different. Steering input, because steering is one of the only things we have force feedback from, having that replicate the real life car, it's got to be done. It's what it's there for. The other thing with this is, if you run a faster rack, a shorter rack, so 450 degrees, maybe 280 even, you fix it and then you go and drive the old 60s, 70s or 80s cars, you've got a big advantage over anyone else you might be competing against that isn't cheating effectively by doing that. If they're running soft lock and they've got 1040 degrees of rotation and you're running 280, you can literally catch slides, counter steer, turn those wheels from like one way to the other in a fraction of the time it takes the people running soft lock, with the genuine steering rotation of those older cars. Now obviously that's up to you what you want to do. If you're just racing to win, to get up the leaderboards, to win an event or whatever, then you're probably going to do that anyway. But for me, because I don't really care and I'd rather have more of a visceral experience, I'd rather go from an old car into a new car and go, wow, the steering is so responsive in this Fiesta R5 compared to the Audi I've just come from out of Group B back in the 80s. I want that, but each to their own at the end of the day. But that's what it does, and that's why I think you should have it on. Now, if this is greyed out, it's because you haven't calibrated the steering wheel. I think it even prompts you to calibrate the wheel here in Dirt Rally. It won't let you turn soft lock on otherwise. So finally, force feedback, vibration obviously on. Self-aligning torque is at 50. Self-aligning torque is where the gyroscopic effect of the front wheels of your car rotating naturally want to center the steering wheel and point your wheels forward. In real life, if you come out of a corner and you let go of the steering wheel, obviously at low speed, don't do this at fast speeds, the wheel will center itself. This is because the front wheels of the car have a gyroscopic centering effect where they're rotating forward. This is what this is here. If you're going down a straight and you just move the wheel left to right ever so slightly, this is the force at which it will try and center itself with. Quite simple. Wheel friction is a blanket weight, you might say, to the steering wheel. A lower figure means the steering wheel will feel a bit lighter, and a higher figure will make it feel overall heavier. And this doesn't change based on how hard you're cornering or what speed you're doing or anything like that. It's literally just a fixed amount of weight that you can set. For me, 15 is about right. Any lower, and I think the wheel feels too easy to move, off that center spot. Tire friction works similarly to wheel friction, but this is a dynamic friction. This is based on the rotation of the tyres, the angle of the tyres, how much load and weight there is on the tyres. So, if you're cornering hard and fast, there's going to be a lot of weight on the tyres, assuming you've got grip. If you were to then understeer, for example, you'd notice them go much lighter. So that tyre friction, when you're stationary and you dry steer, this will make it feel heavier there. And then as you pull off, it will get a little bit lighter. Your steering overall, this is, as it would do in real life. But increasing this will make times where the tyres are loaded up and gripping really well heavier, and when tyres are lost grip, understeer or whatever, you'll notice the difference, and it'll go much lighter, and there'll be a bigger delta between the two. So that's, yeah, it's literally as it sounds, the friction of the tyres. How much do you want that to make your wheel feel heavy or light, and you'll adjust the figure accordingly. For me, 30 is about right. Suspension is like an effect, really. It's feeding back what the suspension is picking up on, lumps and bumps, road texture, potholes if there were any, and feeding that back through your steering wheel. Now in real life, a car with power steering for example, you feel very little as far as road texture goes through the actual steering wheel. We feel it all through the chassis of the car, through our bums, through sitting in the seat. You know, if you go over a pothole and you grimace, you go, ah, you didn't feel it through the steering wheel. You felt the whole car jar and shake as you hit that pothole. The steering wheel barely even twitches in those scenarios. More so if you don't have power steering, but certainly with power steering and EPAS particularly, you feel almost nothing. But because for a lot of us, our steering wheels are our only form of feedback, maybe you haven't got tactile transducers, maybe you haven't got motion, the wheel can simulate what's going on with the lumps and bumps, and it is a good effect to have if it is your only form of physical feedback. So for me, I have full motion, so I wouldn't have this at 45. I've chosen 45 because I think that's a nice setting for people that do want it to come through the steering wheel rather than through their rig, if that was to be able to move. Collision, 70%. That's, as it sounds, if you collide into something, if you have an accident, hit something hard, it's how much force that impact will be translated through the steering wheel. Collisions are generally quite hard, so I like to have it up reasonably high so you feel like you've had a good smack when you do. Again, you can go out on stage and try all these settings one at a time. You can literally turn them all to 0 and just tune one at a time if you want. Gradually turning it up and seeing how it makes the wheel feel, and at what points in your drive it affects how the wheel feels. So you can go out smacking into things and adjust your collision if you want to. Soft lock is the strength, how much of the motor's power it uses to maintain that virtual steering lock or degrees of rotation that I spoke about a minute ago. This isn't a powerful wheel, so 100% you want to use all of the motor strength to stop you accidentally pushing beyond that point. Even with the 8 Nm power pack, the boost kit that I'm running here, you still don't really get any oscillation at 100%. If you were to do it with 2 fingers on the wheel, you might feel a little oscillation, but that isn't how we drive. We've probably got 2 hands on the wheel, or at least 1 hand, and we're gripping it fairly solidly. So 100% is fine. And speaking about the 8 Nm power supply, these figures are all tuned on the 8 Nm power supply. The 5 Nm one, you may want to turn some of them up a little bit, but not by massive amounts. You'll be surprised how little difference it actually makes, because most of the time you're not using 8 Nm. Because if you were, let's say your wheel ran 8 Nm for every single thing that was happening throughout an entire sim, nothing would feel any different. The wheel would feel exactly the same the whole time. So most of the time, what you're feeling is way less than 8 Nm, all the little details and the texture and the grip of the tyres. The 8 Nm only comes into play when you either smack something and you've got the collision up high, or when you are loading those tyres up as much as it physically can and the telemetry stream is saying use maximum force. So yeah, it's only really at those high end moments that the 5 Nm setup would feel a bit lighter than what this 8 Nm one would. So you'll probably find that these settings here won't vary that much if you're using the 5 Nm one. But the whole point of this video guide is to teach you what each one does so you can tweak it yourself. Because as I said at the very beginning, if you haven't got this huge Sparco rally wheel that I have, these are going to feel potentially totally horrible to you, because I obviously have much more leverage, much more depth, everything feels completely differently. So, this is for you to learn how to do a lot of it yourself, as well as perhaps using my settings as a base guide. Final setting, steering center force. This does one thing and one thing only. It has absolutely nothing to do with the driving experience. You may have watched other YouTube guys that tell you it does. It does not. It's got nothing to do with when you're driving. This simply centers your steering wheel at the start of a rally stage When the countdown timer begins, it will spin the wheel round to the centre if it's not already centred. And if you've had an accident, let's say you went round a hairpin left and you're on full left lock and you crashed, ended up down the side of a bank into a tree. When you then reset back on track, if you don't have this on, you'll still be full left lock. And if you accelerated away, you'd fly off to the left. With steering centre force on, it will centre the steering wheel when you reset back on track after an accident or at the start of a rally stage. And steering centre force, the percentage, 50, is how much of your wheelbase's strength it uses to do this. For me, 50% is fine. If you have it too high, you risk it spinning around when you're not paying attention, catching your fingers or your hands and potentially injuring yourself. Anyway, that hopefully covers everything. Thank you very much for watching. Any questions, stick them in the comments. And as always, take it easy.